Jackie, I've got a bedtime story for you.
Are you going to put me to sleep?
No. There was this guy in the 1980s, right? And he said something along the lines of, if the president of the US wanted to launch like a devastating missile, nuclear assault and kill a lot of people, that the codes required to launch the rockets should be in a capsule implanted in the chest of a volunteer, ideally a willing volunteer.
Sounds terrifying.
Yeah. So he would have to basically cut it out and kill a guy in order to make the emotional decision of whether to go and launch a strike. Isn't that not the most terrifying thing you've heard today?
And probably the worst bedtime story I've ever heard. But that was in the 1980s.
Yeah.
We are now in 2023.
Yeah.
Artificial intelligence could take that out of the equation, the human element out. Is it still relevant?
That's the question. There might not even be a button anymore. So let's talk AI and warfare.
World War I was the first mass conflict of the industrialized era. It caused loss of life on a scale never seen before. With World War II came airplanes and bombing raids that brought the conflict to civilians' homes thousands of miles from combat zones. In the present day, artificial intelligence is the next big front. It could either remedy the problems of the past or accentuate them. One of the biggest breakthroughs occurred last year when the U.S. Department of Defense's research arm, also known as DARPA, developed AI algorithms that successfully piloted an F-16 fighter jet. Sure, autonomous airplanes aren't new, but these warplanes don't just fly unmanned. They can dogfight. Yes, like in Top Gun. Aerial combat is incredibly complex, and these algorithms are programmed to undergo a variety of warlike conditions. They not only matched the speed and precision of a human pilot, they were better. Okay, these models haven't made it into combat IRL just yet, but AI is already on the battlefield in other ways. For instance, neural networks have helped analyze satellite and social media feeds to target artillery positions. Autonomous ships and undersea drones for mine hunting have also been used. The hope is that AI can reduce the toll war takes on human lives by putting more machines instead of people on the front lines. Still, there's thorny ethical questions to grapple with first. How much autonomy do we give systems that can deliver lethal force, and who's accountable when a mission goes wrong? Slowing down could help militaries better understand the promise and perils of AI. But with fierce geopolitical competition setting the pace, it's not a matter of when AI becomes the weapon of choice in warfare, but who gets there first.
Thanks for joining us, Trae.
Thanks for having me.
So you're a partner at Founders Fund. You're also a co-founder of a defense tech startup called Anduril.
That's right.
You said conflict is an unfortunately inevitable thing, but we should be developing technology to deter and engage the most efficient and ethical way possible. Like, deterrence comes up a lot in things that you tweet.
That's right.
Like, can you just unpack that a little bit and your view on that?
So in the Cold War and in the years shortly after the Cold War, people thought about deterrence as a strategic deterrent, which by using that specific word, they're referencing nuclear arsenals. So can you prevent conflict with the threat of destruction, completely assured destruction? And that worked for a long time after World War II. There was enough of a belief that we needed to stay under a certain threshold that we haven't had a world war since then. That said, in the last 25, 30 years, we've noticed that there have been a lot of international conflicts. And so the way that we think about this at Anduril is that there is an ethical good in preventing conflict. I think most people can agree on that. We don't want there to be conflict. We don't want the loss of human life, civilian, military, or otherwise. And so we have to figure out ways to make the cost of engaging in conflict in human life, in economic costs, in geopolitical, diplomatic costs. We want it to be so high that it becomes unthinkable for an adversary to decide to engage in conventional conflict.
But let's boil this part down, because back during, in the Cold War, you could probably count some warheads. You could count, guns or that machinery. Mm-hmm. You can't really count artificial intelligence. How do you measure the technological might of one country versus another, and where do we stack up?
A lot of this goes to the specific capabilities that are being deployed. You've probably heard a lot about drone swarms that are being built and how that changes the face of conflict. So let's use that as like an anecdotal example of this. So historically, you would have exquisite military systems that cost a lot of money. Things like fighter planes, things like battleships, things like aircraft carriers. And as you said, you can count those things. You're talking about potentially thousands or tens of thousands of assets that are attritable. And they have an expectation, in fact, that if they're used in engagement, that some of them will be lost. And if you approach conflict in that way, you're going to have a very different strategy if your expectation is we're going to lose a bunch of our stuff. So right now, as a great example of how counter air systems are executed, you have these drones that cost tens or maybe low hundreds of thousands of dollars that have a significant quantity behind them. And we're shooting $2.25 million Patriot missiles to shoot them down. This is not a good economic trade-off. And so when you start thinking about some problems like this, you realize that in order to deter conflict, we need to come up with more efficient, economically efficient, conflict efficient ways to counter those threats so that no one's tempted into doing things that they believe they can get away with.
Let me ask you about guardrails quickly. And I'm aware I'm asking you this question and we put an explosion above your head. But like, who should be setting the guardrails when it comes to AI as it's being used in on the battlefield or in, as you say, deterrence and hopefully avoiding battlefields entirely? Like, what should those guardrails be? Who should be setting them and who's guarding the people making the guardrails? We
should be. We are individually responsible for electing our elected representatives who are serving on the core committees that are making these decisions.
But you mean it's the people that have the power? Like, we should be telling people, these are the guardrails we want.
We should be concerned about an authoritarian system calling the shots on what those international regulations are going to be. And this is the risk that we're taking in passivity and saying, like, who's responsible? No one's really responsible. Could we really develop these systems internally? Or do we not have enough guardrails in place? Meanwhile, our adversaries, who have no such democratic controls in their systems, are laying the groundwork for building those technologies, and they're also laying the groundworks in international law for how those technologies are going to be deployed. And this is what we should be concerned about. If we aren't leaning forward into defining those things as a society, we lose our position of leadership to have a seat at that table.
All right, what's no one talking about then that they should be? We've covered what people are talking about that they should shut up about. What aren't they saying? What should Jackie and I have been talking about over breakfast instead?
I think there's a far greater moral quandary around being involved in or investing in social media companies in 2023 than there is in military systems. Our society is being completely decimated by dopamine-injected technology hits.
So I take it you're not on Instagram.
I am not a user of Instagram. And I think that this is a risk that as a society we've accepted as something that the people want. And if you look at what's happening to mental health, what's happening in rates of suicide, what's happening in rates of tribalism and increased polarization politically, these things are all tied back to social media. And so we have a tendency, as I said, to get scared about killer robots. Maybe you should be worried about killer social media that's making it impossible for you to live a thoughtful, reasoned life that has rationality and logic baked in the way that you think about things. You're just responding to the next dopamine hit about what your tribe tells you that you're supposed to believe.
Trae, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure.
It's been a real pleasure.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
On.
Thanks.
Kathleen Fisher, thanks so much for joining us. So you're the Chief Innovation Officer at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. That's kind of a mouthful. It's also known as DARPA. What does DARPA do?
Our job is to look over the horizon to detect and create strategic surprise. The agency was created in 1958 in response to the Sputnik satellite launch when the Russians launched the satellite and the US was taken aback. And the goal was to never be surprised again in that way and to create that kind of surprise whenever we could. So creating Q-like gadgets wherever possible across all different kinds of technology domains.
Kathleen, we spoke ahead of time, and one of the examples, like hypothetical examples that you gave that I found absolutely fascinating as far as AI's usage in what you do goes, was the idea of being able to ingest and classify cables. And I wondered if you could sort of talk us through that example and how that relates to what what you do?
Yeah, declassify it for us.
Right, so one of the challenges of working in national security is the vast amount of information that gets processed. There's lots of different kinds of sensors, there's lots of different kinds of analysts who are producing reports, and a lot of that information is classified at different kinds of levels, and it's getting it all coherent and at the right security level is a real difficult challenge. And so the work that we were talking about was, can we apply cutting edge machine learning, artificial intelligence technology to automatically put in the portion marks and the security classification markings to get it at the right level in an automatic way. And so the work is just a pilot study to see, is this possible at all?
Let's talk about some of that cutting edge technology. Nate, I don't know if you knew, but DARPA actually had the internet before the rest of us eventually found out about it way back when.
I'd heard a rumor.
Yeah, that was my office that did that a long time ago.
Can I say on behalf of everyone, thank you?
My pleasure, and sorry we didn't get the security part right.
Well, I'm interested. I mean, if that, kind of using that as an example, AI is obviously, generating a ton of hype, and now everyday people are using generative AI tools to create images and content, write my emails. But I'm curious, what kind of artificial intelligence technology are you seeing at the cutting edge at DARPA right now that maybe we haven't seen as consumers or even, on the battlefield?
Yeah, so there's the AI space right now is moving incredibly fast, which is one of the challenges that we're seeing, is how do we understand what are the appropriate uses of this technology and what are the potential downsides that we need to be able to defend against. The cutting edge technology has, it obviously incredibly promising, the fluency with which the large language models are able to speak languages and communicate with people in kind of human native forms. So a lot of the applications of that in national security are the same as the kind of applications in the rest of the world, being able to summarize large bodies of text, to be able to give it a whole bunch of documents and say, can you tell me what the top 3 points are? So for example, like after the invasion of Ukraine, the Conti ransomware gang broke up because it was split across both sides of that conflict, and they dumped a huge amount of documents about the inner workings of the ransomware gang. And so one application would be to ask a large language model, a chat agent, to summarize that and highlight what are the key lessons, and be able to help an intelligence analyst to be able to summarize that information really quickly. So to be able to extract the key insights much faster than normally. A potential downside, though, is the propensity of such models to hallucinate, which is a fancy word for just make stuff up.
I'm curious. I'm American, Nate is British, we're allies, but our respective countries have countries that we would not totally consider allies in every respect. Where does the US and even the UK, where do they stack up in terms of advancement in AI and the kind of technology that you guys are developing? Are we behind?
Yeah, so it's really hard to tell where various countries stand in AI machine learning technology. It's clear that a lot of different countries are investing a lot in AI. A lot of the advances that we're seeing coming out and advancing the state of the art are in fact being done by countries, by the US, by companies in the US, by companies in the UK, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, or Meta, DeepMind. There are other companies and other organizations in other countries that are also making significant advances. So it's really important that we maintain our advantage and keep working in this space.
In your experience, maybe we could talk slightly anecdotally here, let's take something like computer vision and machines learning to identify certain objects. How has that progressed? And what are the challenges of moving that to the next level within the confines of the kind of research that you do?
Computer vision starts, or at least for a long time, has worked at kind of the level of the bits, the artifacts of the image itself, not at the level of the semantic object. So instead of seeing a ball, for example, it sees there's a curve and the changes in color gradation. So the way computer vision has worked has been at a much kind of more basic level than the way that people at least think about seeing images. And so I think one of the exciting promises of what GPT-4 might be able to do, which is a brand new released model that is trained both on language and on images is a possibility that we might see a cross synergy between the semantic concepts that are reflected in words and the physical artifacts that are reflected in digital imagery. But that's very speculative, and it's not my exact area of expertise. So I think we'll need to stay tuned there.
Brett Wilkins, great to have you here. Writer, activist, quite a long list, if that's a fair way to describe you. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's great to be here.
How would you describe the hype around AI right now? Have you tried ChatGPT?
I have not tried it yet. I am in no hurry to embrace what's going to probably take my job one day. But I hear it's getting better and better.
It still has a ways to go, I have to say. When I ran your name through ChatGPT this morning, it came up with Brett Wilkins, who is a bodybuilder. Do you get that mistake a lot? It's only missing an S.
Yeah, people who Google my name often tell me that. And the thing is, like, he must be really mad at me because so many times in bodybuilding publications, if you Google his name, they spell it the way my name is spelled, they spell it wrong. So
safe to say you're not a bodybuilder.
He definitely dominates. He's definitely muscled me out of the Google image results.
I like that. That was excellent. That was a good point. Also, I was wondering what you were looking at this morning and why.
Googling normal things.
Why at the office? I mean, one of the things that intrigues me about the concern around artificial intelligence in warfare, we talk about killer robots, we talk about autonomous weapons, like all this sort of thing, is how do you make progress without essentially taking some casualties along the way?
If we just take a look at the record of the U.S. military using, first of all, we have to define the term. What is a killer robot or an lethal autonomous weapon system?
How do you define it?
It's a system that's operating, that's choosing and engaging targets absent any sort of meaningful human control. And so if we look at the record of the military, when it comes to it, people often confuse drones with killer robots. The promise of these AI weapons is that they will be able to better identify, better select targets and avert unnecessary civilian harm. But do we really trust that would be the case given the record of the military using conventional weapons thus far?
Let's talk about defense on the local level. I think often we think about how do these tools look like on the battlefield against whatever country in some, far away distance land. What does it look like at the local level? You've had a lot of experience with, critiquing the policing complex and what that looks like for communities of color. When we think about artificial intelligence, what are some of the things that we should be thinking about here?
Well, definitely thinking about the machine learning is biased because, again, it's programmed by humans. And, I'm proud that in San Francisco several years ago, we passed an ordinance that bans any city agencies from using artificial intelligence, including the police. On the local level here, it definitely have to worry about the biases. And you see, that there's the right-wing side is always like, well, there's no racism in the society anyway. They're like, well, now that we have AI and robots, there'll definitely be no racism because how can a robot be racist? Well, programmers can be, so.
What's your view then if we take away the kill side of things? Like, we've had a lot of conversations about deterrence and about essentially using AI in surveillance. And in London, you cannot walk anywhere without being surveilled. And it's not just the UK. I mean, we've seen this in other countries. We've seen what's happened in China with surveillance and artificial intelligence. It's not about killing, but the end result can still mean the end of something, whether that's life, whether that's freedom, whatever it is. I'm curious to get your stance on where that is going.
Well, you're not really likely to get blown up by a drone if you're living in where we live, but you're much more likely, especially if you're a person of color, to experience exactly the kind of problem that you just described. And honestly, I have not really thought about it that much as far as how to counter that. But again, it just goes to show that we need meaningful human control, and not just any human control. It's got to be the right policies and the right.
Let's touch on that, the right human control and the right policies. A lot of these dudes making this technology based in, on the West Coast, it's concentrated not just geographically, but within a few tech companies who have gotten in trouble for a host of other reasons. Do you trust who's kind of in the driver's seat at this point?
And that's another thing, that's a great point, because when these guidelines and frameworks are being rolled out, they're usually done as a partnership between, say, the military and tech companies, or on the leaning toward the good side, the Vatican and Microsoft came out with, the "Thou shalt not kill." They came out with one that said, the primary purpose of of machine learning should be protecting and serving humans. And this is Silicon Valley, California. They're not the most progressive people, a lot of them, but within those institutions, there are people who are standing up and fighting and demanding. A lot of them lose their jobs, but there are people who are standing up and demanding that these technologies be used in a responsible and ethical, as far as possible, ethical way.
Do you think we've learnt enough from the arms race of the past? Because it was easier to count nuclear warheads and say they're a bigger threat, so we need more than them. That's much harder with AI.
It's an interesting comparison because it's not only about counting, but it's about who's participating and who's not. Dozens of countries have agreed on a treaty to prohibit the use of autonomous lethal weapon systems. The United States has not, Russia has not. Interestingly, China, of all countries, trying to have it both ways, China advocates a treaty against the use of killer robots, but not on the development of them. So it's kind of like they're trying to have it both ways. The danger of that is a global annihilation. Everyone's dead, and the danger that could be an associated danger of that with killer robots as well. The treaty won't work unless everyone signs up to it, and of course the countries that are developing these weapons, and I can name them. They're like Australia, Britain, the United States, Russia, China, France. Don't want anything to do with that.
Do you feel optimistic about the future when it comes to artificial intelligence?
I mean, it's like a interesting question because it's such an encompassing subject that in some ways it's going to make wonderful things in our lives, but in other ways...
In this realm of defense.
I mean, again, I'm not naive. This is coming, and I don't think we're going to be successful at stopping it from coming. At the very best case scenario, these weapons will be better at killing. They'll be better at killing, but they'll still be killing. The United States, for example, says, when we roll this out, we have to be very careful. We have to have the same respect for the rule of law that the United States stands for. Well, in what world is that true? I mean, we've broken just about every agreement, flouted international law by invading how many countries? 20 or more countries just in my lifetime. And so when this kind of language is used, oh, don't worry, there'll be the controls, there'll be safeguards, there'll be accountability. When was any of that occurring before in the conventional space?
What are people not talking about that you think they should be?
Just whether we need this at all. I mean, like we're just talking about now, do we really want to go down this road? I mean, there's too much of this Terminator kind of talk when people talk about killer robots, and that's not the way it's going to go down.
What's your big prediction in a sentence for the future of artificial intelligence in the defense space?
It's the next arms race. It's going to be a new arms race. It's already happening.
Nate, I'm not as scared as I thought I was going to be, even after your terrifying bedtime story.
It was a great tale. I loved that story. I know, and I came in here very pessimistic about a lot of stuff, and now I'm just slightly less pessimistic about everything.
For you, that's progress.